Hi, my name is Daniel, and today I'm going to do a little presentation on the topic of my PhD thesis. It's about class, commerce, and climate, an investigation on a set of circumstances for the rise of capitalism in 15th century England. Um, we're going to explore the conditions for the feudalism to capitalism transition, specifically from the Marxist debate from the 20th century. So, to start here, our introduction, the hypothesis we want to explore is that the change from feudalism to capitalism was conditioned, not determined, but conditioned by climate change, specifically the shift from the medieval climate anomaly from the 14th around the 14th century towards the little ice age after the 15th century. And in this presentation, we're going to explore specifically how those macro phenomena like climate and plague they establish a relation, they interact with short duration events like changes in agriculture techniques, changes in the political landscape of England, changes in socio-class structure. First, Black Death and the specifics of the North Sea basin constitute the basic macro phenomena we want to explore, and how they are a product or how they act on climate change background. Afterwards, we're going to move to the change in agriculture as the peasants and the lords at that time, they create a sort of climate hedge to defend, to protect the crops or their property from all those problems that are happening. And lastly, we want to delve into the transformations in property structures and class structures, which constitute the marrow of the problem here. To begin, a little bit of theory in order to explore our options better. When we talk about the transition debate from Marxist standpoint, we have three major perspectives. The initial debate in the 1940s, 1950s is among Dobb and Sweets. Very different authors. They have a very respectful debate. It's it's the bedrock of the debate. And they have very different theses. Dobb proposes that what led to the downfall of feudalism was the over-exploitation of peasants. As the word changed, the lords, they increased the extraction rate of the economic surplus, and that created a series of conditions in which feudalism collapsed. Sweezy, on the other hand, he goes on to say, well, that's not true. What actually happened is that foreign trade increased a lot, and foreign trade brings a different set of class into the game, and they start to corrode the feudal foundations, the feudal society. And that was the background. A little bit later, in the 1970s, Brenner comes forward in what is called the Brenner debates, in which Brenner debates the Malthusian Orthodox historians, and he defends that what actually matters to explain and to understand the change from feudalism to capitalism is the shape of the class struggle, because the shape of the class struggle defines the transition. It is a transition from feudalism to capitalism because class struggle was in a specific shape and not something different. You could have a transition from feudalism to anything, basically, but it happened to be from feudalism to capitalism because of the shape of the class struggle. And what is feudalism? Well, lots of definitions, but here we're going to focus on the more important ones, which is Dobbs and Sweezy's. Often we think about feudalism as the political arrangement in which you have a king, a lord of the church, and lots of peasants. But that is not what defines it. It's not a political entity, more than, as they say, a mode of production. What defines feudalism is serfdom, a form of slavery, in which the peasant must pay an obligation to the lord. Dobb emphasizes that the economic surplus in a feudal society must be extracted by force, and that is what defines feudalism. Sweezy, on the other hand, is going to be more specific and say, well, economic surplus extracted by force is very common in ancient society, in slavery. What defines serfdom as a historical specificity is that those obligations must be paid in labor. A serf cannot just say, well, I owe you a piece of gold, so I'm going to pay you a piece of gold, and that's it. No. The Lord says, well, you owe me a piece of gold. A piece of gold is like a month of work. You're going to work a month for me. Back to the change, to the transition itself. Dobb presents his argument as such. What led to the downfall of feudalism was the over-exploitation of peasants in the 14th century. 14th century was a century of crisis, and feudal lords had to increase surplus extraction. By doing so, they compromised peasants' material reproduction, and they created an over-pressure on the lower end of the pyramid, and after that, the pyramid collapsed. What is a very important thing to have in mind is why did the lords had to increase the surplus extraction rate? Why couldn't they just adapt to a lower level of economic surplus? We have plenty of examples in history in which a society facing a crisis just accepts to live with less, or just the leads accept to extract less from the subordinate. Why did a feudal lord could not do that? A very important piece of criticism to Dobb. We will return to that in a couple of slides. Now, Sweezy is going to create a different argument. He's going to say, well, it's a foreign trade that matters here, because feudalism lacks what's called an internal engine. The concept of an internal engine is the thing that moves the system forward toward a more contradictory mode of production. Contradictions don't get starker with time in feudalism. It doesn't get worse. It reproduces indefinitely just as it were before. Except, of course, if an external force acts upon it. That's a very neat model, because if you have a mode of production without an internal engine, one thing that can just keep moving forever without getting more contradictions or more intense contradictions, so then that's a stable system. You don't have to worry about it changing. The only way to explain change is, of course, if you introduce an external force. However, what we must ask ourselves is, does the evidence we have today support Sweezy's argument? Mostly it does not. Well, foreign trade doesn't act like that. Most times, foreign trade even emboldens feudal structures instead of corroding it. Now, when Brenner goes on to talk about his view on the transition, he emphasizes that class struggle in the 14th century was a very specific matter. Why is that? Because if you take a look at what's happening, you see lots of peasants' victory. They are very successful in destroying the mode of slavery in Europe, which was serfdom. However, they could not, and that's what Brenner raises the flag. They could not change the property structure of Europe. Uh, they remained a property-less class. The lords still controlled the property, the land property specifically. And what is very interesting for us is that he proposes that feudalism had an internal engine. Contradictions did get started at this time. And he says, well, the internal engine of feudalism is political accumulation. What is that? A feudal lord must have economic resources because he's facing the constant threat to his own existence posed by his feudal lord's neighbors. As such, he must not accept less of an economic surplus because it endangers his survival as a political actor. Now, what we must ask of Brenner is, why does class struggle take this shape and not any other else? If you take a look at the theories we have here, Sweezy talks about foreign trade, Dobe about overexploitation, Brenner about class struggle. Dobe and Brenner are very much alike. They have a very strong synergy. Sweezy has an interesting point. Feudalism doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens regarding something. So, what if we think about all the external factors that act upon feudalism and affect the foundations of it? Sweezy talks about foreign trade. We propose we have a climate catalyst happening here. That's when we start talking about the macro phenomena. First of all, 14th century must talk about the Black Death. The Black Death changed completely the demographic level. After the Black Death, you had an enormous amount of vacant land plots. Those land plots, in the 13th century, you had a land-hungry society. Everyone wanted a piece of land. There was no land for people to get. They were subdividing our land plots. However, after the Black Death, the amount of land that's unoccupied is huge. And that land is appropriated simultaneously by both lords and peasants. That changes everything, as we're going to say when we talk about changes in society. Also, here, and that is very, very important, you have a change in the raining pattern. In the 14th century, you begin to see what's called an increase in the North Sea storminess. Storminess is a measure not of the amount of water that's raining, but about the intensity of it. Rains are not evenly distributed in the year. They are concentrated in big storms that are catastrophic for crops, specifically for wheat crops. And that is something that's happened on the North Sea basin. It's not happening all across Europe. It's happening specifically around some lands on the North Sea basin. And that is very, very important when we take a look at the North Sea, the North Sea's basin's ecological features. Because the coast around the North Sea is composed mostly of wetlands and marshlands. In England, they're called fenlands. And the occupation of said lands always, throughout history, throughout Roman times, Neolithic, wherever you want to go, those occupations always had to deal with floods and storms. So they are part of a society that must deal with that. However, they came from a very stable period in which those floods and storms were behaving in a certain way. After the 14th century, those floods and storms change. Look here, it's a map of what I'm talking about. Those red areas, those are the floodlands. They are marshlands, and when the rains come, storms, both the rising of the sea and as the accumulation of water in the upstream that flows down towards those floodlands. When the storm is increased, those floodlands flood and they become marsh. And marsh is offered for raising, for planting wheat, planting grains. Certain crops become impossible to grow as the climate change. Grains are very sensitive to those rainfall pattern changes. And so peasants cannot grow wheat anymore. They must specialize in what they can produce. And in England, it's very clear. Peasants change from planting wheat to tending sheep. See, it's not about creating a new way of production from zero. It's about adapting what already is. So the same peasants, they both planted wheat and raised sheep, but now they could no longer plant wheat because, well, the land plot became marsh. They had to raise sheep. After the 14th century, the relative weight of both activities shift in favor of the sheep. Not because, well, the market for wool is raising and the market for wheat is declining. It's both things happen. Sometimes it's wheat's more valuable, sometimes wool's more valuable. But it doesn't matter if the price of wheat is 1,000 gold pieces for grain if you cannot raise, if you cannot plant wheat. You produce what you can as a medieval peasant, well, as anyone actually. Sheep is far better in the climate change context because it's easier to adapt to those extreme climate events which are happening. In the short term, we can have transhumates. If there is a big storm, you can take your sheep and go away. You cannot take your wheat crop and go away. No matter how convincing you are, you'll never talk a wheat plant of growing legs and moving out. You can talk to a sheep. You can rear a sheep away. You cannot do that with a wheat crop. More than that, wetlands keep their fertility as feeding grounds. You can still use those wetlands to feed your sheep. Also, you have international demand for the product. Wool is not out of fashion. That creates a consolidation of a specialization pattern which radiates from the England East Coast. You have cereal cultivation on lion soils away from the North Sea Basin, and you have sheep raising on marshlands closer to the North Sea Basin. That's great. However, product specialization is not by itself capitalism. You can have product specialization in a feudal context. However, you also have a change in the social structure of the society. Because, well, class dynamics always happen. Class is a dynamic process, and they are changing even before climate change. First, you have a transformation of the pattern ability, and also you have a transformation of the rich peasants. What's the transformation in pattern ability? Well, knights, which is the pattern ability by excellence of feudal England, they go through a concentration process. You have less knights in the 14th century than you had in the beginning of the 13th century. Those knights are richer, more powerful, but are less in number. And that's very relevant because knights in that part of medieval England, that period in medieval England, they had administrative duties. They were government officials. You have a decline in what we would call a civil servant today. They're less bureaucrats to run the state. So those jobs that must be kept, the activities of the state, they begin to be delegated to non-knights, those who have kinship ties with nobility but are not initially themselves nobles. Squires and gentlemen, as the literature calls them, more important than ever, gentlemen are the gentry, the new class that's arising. Those guys, they're also landlords. and that is very important. When you look at the peasants, you have changes happening among them. Uh, you have intra-peasantry differentiation throughout medieval times. You had bailiffs, which was like administrative peasants. But after the Black Death, richer peasants became a more important figure. They started to incorporate empty lands, and as by doing such, they intensified inter-peasant differentiation, which is a very fancy way of saying that rich peasants got richer and poor peasants got poorer. Those social changes, both among gentlemen and among human, they have those new social classes have a new social status. They're not as feudal classes were. Why? Because their social status is not based on custom. You cannot say, well, my father was a yeoman, so I'm a yeoman, you owe me something. No. They lack a socially recognized way to claim a share of the economic surplus. They cannot get money just by being bored. Those actors need the market in order to maintain or improve their economic instance. They pop up when social fabric is weakening because they are a symptom of they are the new thing. There has always been a richer peasant and a strange administrator, but they are always very limited expressions of society. After the Black Death, with the climate change, they bloom. The most important historical news, most important historical novelty here is their growing. That is only possible because of the conditions, because of the climate change. Why? Wool production, which is a fruit consequence of the climate change, allows them to extract rent through market, even in land passes that were otherwise useless due to the increase of storminess in North Sea Basin. A feudal lord could not possibly extract rent from an empty land plot because there were no peasants there. But a landed gentry could rent that land away for a yeoman raising sheep, and therefore sell that ship for the Hanseatic League, and therefore gain money, gain rent from that. The incorporation of empty lands left behind after the Black Death helps to gives that change momentum to expand said rent. And as Brenner says, those actors are acting under the shadow of feudalism, and they manage to change property structure to suit their own demands. The enclosures, very famous in literature, they help increase rent extraction. And those enclosures are only possible because of the macro changes, those macro phenomena we're talking about. It happens because of the empty lands that we have there. It happens because the traditional techniques are not suitable to be used on the flooded lands. It's the climate change that prompts that creates the conditions in which those social changes gain momentum, they gain velocity. And so, to conclude, our point here is that macro phenomena create a series of conditions in which social change happens. That shapes conditions. It does not determine. It could have been different, but it were not. It was possible because of macro phenomena, because of climate change, Black Death, of the increased storminess of the North Sea Basin, of the geological process of wetland formations in the east coast of England. That is the bedrock in which social change may happen. At the same time, that's very important, English society is undergoing its own development. development trajectory, uh, the contraction of the ninth class is not because of climate change. It's happening because it's happening. It has an engine of its own, but it is fundamental to the change of property class. And because of the climate change, it can go faster than ever. It can be more consequential than ever. And those are the crossroads from which capitalism emerges. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.